genel izleyici kitlesi için uygundur.
Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden, farklı milletlerden konuklarla bölgesel, küresel meselelere dair farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta tüm dünyanın gündemine kelimenin tam anlamıyla bomba gibi düşen bir filmi konuşacağız. Oppenheimer'ı. Atom bombasının mucidi fizikçi Robert Oppenheimer'ın hayatını konu edinen 3 saatlik etkileyici film malum vizyona girdi. İşte bu hafta bu filmi bir bilim insanıyla konuşacağız. Kolombiya Üniversitesi'nden bir bilim insanıyla. Kendisi dünyanın nükleer silahlardan arınması için yıllardır mücadele veren bir nevi aktivist de aynı zamanda. Doktor Ivana Nikolic Hughes bizlerle olacak. Aslında şunu da söyleyeyim, başlamadan önce röportajımıza kendisinin enteresan bir bağlantısı da var filmle. Şu anda fizikçi eşiyle birlikte Doktor Ivana New York'ta Kolombiya Üniversitesi yakınlarında oturduğu dairede aslında filmde de gördüğümüz ünlü fizikçi Isaac Rabin'in yıllar önce oturduğunu belirtelim. Oppenheimer'la Rabin'in nükleer silahların kontrolünü konuştukları dairede aslında yaşıyor kendisi. Birazdan ekranda da göreceksiniz siyah beyaz bu kareyi. Filmi izledikten sonra Doktor Ivana bir yazı da yazdı. Oppenheimer filminin kendisinde ve oradaki bilim çevrelerinde uyandırdığı duygu, düşüncelere dair. Biz de bu hafta hem bu yazı üzerinden gündemdeki bu filmi hem de bu filmin düşündürdüklerini konuşacağız. Dr. Ivana, welcome. Thank you very much for joining my show second time.
Thank you, Feyza, so very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be with you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Dr. Ivana. Well, first of all, we have a lot of things to talk about the movie, but let me ask you, how did you find the movie first? Very briefly.
Feyza, I saw the film last Saturday, and I think last night and the night before were the first times that I didn't have dreams about it all night long. I thought it was absolutely brilliant and magnificent. I thought it was just a tremendous, truly epic achievement in terms of the way in which the history was covered, as well as the way in which the characters just had so much depth and were just absolutely fascinating. And again, also historically accurate. I absolutely love the film, and I encourage anyone who hasn't seen it to go and see it.
I agree. I also encourage everyone.
Yes, yes, for sure.
Do you have any criticism, you or your colleagues, Dr. Ivana, by the way? And I assume that you probably read the book American Prometheus. So you already, as a scientist, I'm sure you knew about the story of Oppenheimer. Do you have any criticism at all?
Yeah, I read the book, soon after it came out, and just thought it was a magnificent achievement as well, and really enjoyed reading it. Around that time, my husband is a professor of physics at Columbia. We moved in with our then 2, and now we have 3 children into Robbie's apartment. So his wife, Helen Robbie, lived to be 102 and passed away in 2005. And it just so happened that we moved to Columbia in 2006. And, what I referred to in my article as we inherited the Robbie apartment. And so I was very well aware of this history. Of course, several years later, we sort of embarked on some projects, research and teaching projects to raise awareness of the nuclear threat. And I've since been playing more of a role also outside of Columbia at an organization called the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. So much of this history was known to me through the book, through reading and so on. But I still just found the film breathtaking. And when I was watching it, I already knew. So as you mentioned, there's a scene in the book American Prometheus that describes this apartment where you see behind me the bookcase and the fireplace. So Robbie and Oppenheimer had this conversation here in December of 1945 about international control of nuclear weapons. it turns out that I learned very early that scene was not actually in the film. And so I knew that there was no scene with a New York City apartment in the film. But so when I went, I wasn't quite sure what would happen to the character of Robbie. You know, he could have been one of the more marginal characters in the film. And of course, the film is 3 hours long and has dozens of people, really. But I was looking for him, and it was absolutely, to me, just so heartwarming and just wonderful that he was presented in an incredibly positive light, which he also deserves. So,
yeah, exactly. Ivana, I was going to ask you, because he was portrayed very positively, besides maybe Einstein of all the other scientists. So how did you find, and could you also tell us more about their roles, especially Robbie's role? Because as far as I know, he was not part of the Manhattan Project, but he attended the Trinity test. So could you tell us the portrayal of him and also his role throughout the process?
Absolutely. I mean, to me, Feyza, Robbie comes across as the moral compass of the entire story. And so we see him very early on, as we should, as a friend of Oppenheimer's in Europe. Both of them are young. They're both Americans in Europe studying the new physics, studying quantum mechanics. And then we see his friendship with Oppenheimer throughout, all the way to the security clearance hearing, where Robbie offers his support both inside and outside of the interrogation room. And he's clearly a very good friend of Oppenheimer's. But it's not just him being a good friend. It's when it comes to the issue of nuclear weapons, which the film really forces us to confront, he is, as I said, the moral compass. And so what we see, and I'll highlight 3 scenes. We see him having a conversation with Oppenheimer about joining the Manhattan Project, and he says no, and he didn't join it. And he says, I don't want 300 years of physics to culminate in making of a bomb. Then we see him during the Trinity test, as you said. He wasn't part of the project, but he was at the test. He had by then already had a Nobel Prize in physics, and actually for a discovery that gave us magnetic resonance imaging. So even in real life, you know, he gives us this amazing thing that is now helping in medicine so very much. And so at the Trinity test, you know, we see this jubilation. We witness the jubilation, the celebration of the scientists that they had just achieved this. We see Oppenheimer as, I think, confused and dazed, but we see Robbie as devastated. It's a split second. And again, because of my connection, I was looking for him. But for people who haven't seen the movie, watch for it. Or if you see it a second time, watch for it, and it's there. And I'll highlight one more scene, and that's the scene where they're discussing, it's the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission, and they're discussing whether or not the United States should begin the hydrogen bomb program. This is, of course, having made atomic bombs, we're now talking about making bombs that are thousands of times more powerful. And we did make them, and we do have them today. So again, you know, if Hiroshima and Nagasaki were on the scale of hundreds of thousands of people, hydrogen bombs can kill on the order of hundreds of millions of people. But at that point, Robbie says in that committee discussion, Robbie calls hydrogen bombs weapons of genocide. And so we really see him, as I said, as this moral compass of the narrative. And I think Christopher Nolan did Robbie justice and just did a really beautiful job presenting this man who was part of the history, but really very much on the right side of history, I would say.
So Nolan did justice to Robbie. What about Oppenheimer himself, Dr. Ivana? Let's talk about him. And what do you think, what did you feel as a scientist about his main motivation for him to really develop this, to participate in this project? Is it his hatred towards Nazi Germany, or his patriotism, or simply success? What do you think? What did you feel about his main motivation or motivations?
I have no doubt that it's a real combination. He clearly loved his country. He clearly was very, very much disturbed by what was happening in Nazi Germany, and especially to Jews. And he was Jewish, of course, brought up here in the United States, but Jewish. By the way, he was brought up on Riverside Drive, just, about 20 blocks south of where I am right now. So, but this sense of importance and success, I think the film does a beautiful job of presenting him as this truly complicated character. The other attribute I would give him, especially in light of the film's portrayal, is tortured, right? He's tortured as a scientist, he's tortured as a person, he's tortured as a father, as a lover, as a husband. He's just a very complex person. But I was most struck by the sense of how much ambition, how much of a role ambition played in what he was doing and when. And for me, it was actually in the film that I kind of got this hint, and the hint comes from the worst of characters. It comes from essentially the film's villain is Louis Strauss, who was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission and who sort of vindictively, sets up this whole chain of events in motion that essentially pulls Oppenheimer out of public life. But he's the one that says that Oppenheimer was against hydrogen bombs, not for moral reasons, but because he wanted to remain the father of the world's most powerful weapon. And that's a devastating, portrayal. But again, to me, what was so beautiful about the film was the way in which the characters were developed, in the way in which they were that we were exposed to both complex characters like Oppenheimer, but also this full range of human qualities, from the goodness of Robbie all the way to the evil of Louis Strauss. I just thought that was done really, really beautifully. And so in some sense, to me, it's a study of human character that uses this very unusual, historical moment of starting the nuclear age, but really showing us also how fallible we as humans, as individuals, truly are. And I think the ultimate message of that is that we cannot be trusted with weapons like the ones that Oppenheimer developed and we developed afterwards as well.
Right. Dr. Ivana, by the way, what do you think also, what do you feel about the responsibility of scientists? Because that's another question maybe the movie raises, I guess. And some people justify, or in the past justified, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the World War II, and it prevented further losses, even like maybe greater losses. So was the decision to drop the atomic bombs on civilians morally justifiable? And what do you think about the role of scientists, responsibility of scientists? Because eventually, at the end of the day, the decision makers, the leaders, political leadership, make the decision, but scientists involved in the project also have a responsibility. So what do you think?
That's a great question, Feyza. Well, in my mind, what I would say that if I have one criticism of the film, it's really that it leaves us with this impression that the bombings were unnecessary evil. And that I think many historians dispute that analysis of what actually took place and consider that the United States really used the bombs in these attacks as a way of communicating to the Soviet Union, as opposed to as a way of ending the war. In many ways, people consider these attacks to have been the beginning of the Cold War rather than the end of the hot war. And there are some hints of this in the film. that this was an essentially defeated enemy or a defeated enemy, but perhaps not as strongly as they could have been. What I do think the film presents very clearly is that when scientists do something like this, ultimately the discovery is not going to be in their hands, and ultimately, even, obviously there was a group of scientists. This is also hinted at. There's a scene where Oppenheimer is meeting a couple of people in a lobby of a hotel, and they're handing him, it's called the Frank Report, and it's a report of scientists saying, we built the bomb, we should not use it on Japan, we should not use it on civilians. But we also see, and there, it's really, a little muddy with Oppenheimer, because he sort of mentions this, but doesn't stand behind that as forcefully as perhaps he could have. Even so, it's possible that he could have been as forceful as he wanted to be, and that Truman would have still gone ahead. There's also that scene where he talks to Truman, and Truman, as he's walking out, calls him a crybaby scientist. And so, I think it's a lesson for scientists that, once if you're doing this under the auspices of a national government, that national government can and will use what you're doing. For me, as I said, for us, being at Columbia, my husband Emily Hughes and I, about a dozen years ago, both kind of recognized how big the threat is, but also recognized that in order for the problem to get solved, scientists had to be involved. Mm-hmm. That scientists were part of the problem, but have to also be a part of the solution.
Yeah. So you don't really, you and your colleagues there, don't really blame him then, right? I mean, for all.
Well, I think history like this is complicated. I don't. Is it easy to blame someone like Oppenheimer for being brilliant, for being charismatic, for being capable of, actually bringing such a monumental project to fruition? Sure, we can blame him for all those things. Turns out that Nazi Germany did make attempts and did not get very far. The issue, of course, is why did the project continue when Germany was defeated?
Exactly, that's the question, yeah.
There was one scientist, the Polish scientist, Josef Rodblat, who left, he's not featured in the film, but he left the Manhattan Project after Nazi Germany surrendered, and he later won the Nobel Prize for Peace for his work on nuclear disarmament. So, we can blame him, but the question is, would there be somebody else who would have done this? And for me, it's more about criticizing the systems that are allowing this that allowed this not just to have happened, but to continue to this day. We're still threatened by these weapons, in many ways much more so than we were in 1945 when we had 3 of them, and now we have 13,000. So, to me, it's the systems, not the scientists, but the scientists, the individuals, should be aware that they could and will be used. And that's kind of addressed in the film too. I think Einstein sort of says, they'll just forget all about you. They'll just use you, and then they won't care what happens to you. I think that's a powerful message.
Mm-hmm. So that's what you and your colleagues agree on commonly. What do you guys talk there in that very apartment? I wonder, Dr. Ivana, and we have only 2 minutes left. So how is the general mood and sentiment in that apartment, especially these days after watching the movie?
Yeah, no, the general mood is one of excitement for having the opportunity to have millions of people think about nuclear weapons. And for us, I think the nuclear disarmament community, it's our job to fill in the gaps. Does the film tell us everything we need to know about nuclear weapons? Of course not. But it's our job to fill in those gaps, to talk about the way that these weapons have impacted us since 1945, and that's things like nuclear testing and so on that we talked about before. and could impact us in the future. And really, there's a whole sequence in the film about the near zero probability of destroying the world.
Yes,
And that's
yeah, that was also a shocking thing that they took that risk, not
Right,
zero,
right.
but near zero, which is still too much to take, I guess, as a risk.
But it's also the way in which the film kind of ends, right? That we already, destroy the world. And for me, this is the moment to ensure that we do not destroy the world and that we actually go forward with getting rid of nuclear weapons in a serious way.
Yeah. Well, $1 million question. You and other scientists will watch Barbie as well.
I will have to. The Barbenheimer was powerful. I haven't seen Barbie, but I will have to watch it.
Okay, let's make another conversation after you watch Barbie then. Thank you so much, Dr. Ivana.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Feyza. Thanks so much.
Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta Oppenheimer'ı konuştuk, bir bilim insanıyla konuştuk. Ivana Nikolic Hughes, Columbia Üniversitesi'nden kimyager, kendisi aynı zamanda dünyanın nükleer silahlardan arınması için de uzun yıllardır mücadele veren bir aktivist. Bugün biraz kendisinin de çok yakından takip ettiği, röportaj sırasında da bahsettiğimiz gibi fizikçi Isaac Rabin'in de evini paylaşan bir bilim insanı aynı zamanda biraz bu süreci hem kendisinin o yaşadığı aynı apartmanda oturması hasebiyle yaşadığı o heyecanı hem de filmle alakalı bilim insanlarının neler düşündüğünü konuşmaya çalıştık. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla görüşmek üzere. Hoşça kalın.